we know how prevalent and important it is as a workforce, as a productive workforce in Pakistan. But they are not counted in the female labor participation rate, which stands today at a low 20.1%. That's data from the labor force survey of 2017-2018. And there are many constraints for women to enter the labor force in the country. But we at the World Bank are committed to support the government of Pakistan to improve to increase this female labor force participation. I understand there's a target to reach 45% by 2025. That's a huge ambition, and we are continuously working with the authorities to find engagements and projects where we could contribute to that. And home-based work is one topic we are particularly focused on, including in terms of the registration and the legal aspects linked to home-based workers. So I don't want to speak too much. I'm really eager to hear from the expert panel that we have today, and really thank you for joining us on this important day. Let me introduce the panel. We're happy to have Mrs. Leila Azhar, who's Executive Director of HomeNet Pakistan, which is an umbrella organization working on home-based workers in the country. Happy to also have Marty Chen, who's the Senior Advisor of the Women and Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, VIGO organization. Thank you for joining. We also have a colleague from the ILO, Sergey Suarez, who's a labor economist and co-author of a report on working from home called From Invisibility to Decent Work. My colleague, Maria Beatriz Orlando, thanks for joining. She's a lead social development specialist at the World Bank and has worked extensively on this topic. And we also have Mrs. Hasina Ali, who is a home-based worker and micro-business owner in Karachi. So, dear panel members, really thank you for joining today. Thanks to all the participants and those connected. And again, all happy International Women's Day. And over to the panel. Uzma, please, over to you. And thank you, Uzma, for organizing it and for all the work. You, Huma, and the whole team. I should have started with you. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Uzma.
Thank you so much, Najib. Happy International Women's Day to all of you who joined us today. Khawateen ka Alami Din Mubarak ho aap sabko. As you know, this webinar is going to focus on home-based workers that are one of the largest categories of informal workers in Pakistan. And our eminent panelists today, Naji has introduced them. They will discuss different facets of home-based workers issues and recommendations to improve the situation. And some of us and most of us, we also know that ILO's Convention 177 is on home workers' rights, to recognize them as workers, to improve their access to decent wages and social security. So Pakistan has not ratified C177 yet, but this convention is at the base of several draft legislations that are under process in different provinces, and the law that was passed in Sindh in 2018 from home-based workers. So before I turn to our first panelist, who is Sergey Suarez, Naji has introduced him. He is labor economist at ILO. I just want to tell all participants, you can send your questions in the chat section. Please keep them coming, and we will direct them to the panelists during the discussions. So Sergey is the co-author of the report. Naji has mentioned it. So over to you, Sergey, to briefly highlight the report findings.
Thank you very much. So is the presentation on the, okay. So thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to start by saluting and greeting all the women here, and in particular thanking the people who are organizing this, most of whom are women, by the way, right? So, and saying that I'm very happy to be here presenting a report, Working from Home, From Invisibility to Decent Work, okay? So in the first slide, we start with the, if the next, yeah, exactly. We start on talking about how homework has always existed. It's not a new form of production. The first picture shows home workers in New York City 120 years ago. Then we have another picture of a home worker in Pakistan making footballs, and in the middle, a teleworker in the United States. So in spite of numerous economists having decreed the death of homework as being an archaic form of production, it has survived and even thrived in some places. It's not going away anytime soon, and it's up to us and all policymakers and politicians to make sure that we have homework becomes a source of decent work and not often a source of, let us say, precarious work, which has often been the case. So in the next slide, we talk a little bit about definitions. So we consider home-based workers anybody who works from home on a permanent basis, which is the you can see by the little bar at the bottom of the graph. Of these, Convention 177 considers as home workers those who are employees or in a dependent or disguised employment relationship, which means they are declared self-employed, but they are dependent on a single customer, which is usually a dependent relationship. We have also teleworkers who, if they work from home on a permanent basis, they are considered home workers. Otherwise, they are teleworkers, they're still teleworkers, but not considered home workers, okay? So the next slide tells us how many home workers there are. So as Naji already said, in 2019, there were around 260 million home workers in the world. With the pandemic, this has gone up to about 600 million, which is about 1 out of every 5 workers, so quite a lot more. And back to 2019, of these, about 50 million were home workers. The others were home-based workers. Even I get confused with these definitions. So there about 50 million of them are employees or home workers, and some amount among the other 150 million who are own account workers are in a dependent relationship, but it is often hard to say how many. So going to the next slide, we can see the disadvantages and advantages of homework. So let's start with the advantages. First, homework allows women, and it's mostly women, 60% of home workers are women, to reconcile unpaid care work with other domestic obligations and with paid labor. So women who cannot, for some reason, leave the home manage to make a living, okay? It allows for flexible hours, and it allows for those who need adapted workplaces, such as workers with disabilities, to use their already adapted home as their workplace, okay? For employers, it allows to share risk with their employees as to the size of the market, although this is it's a benefit for employers, not exactly a benefit for their employees, and it lowers costs such as office space. And for everybody, potentially, it reduces pollution and allowing workers to live far from expensive and crowded urban centers. But homework, unfortunately, has many disadvantages. There's a large wage penalty, a large social protection gap. Training is usually designed to be given at employers' premises and not designed for home workers. There are occupational safety and health challenges, not only for home workers, but for their families. There is the issue of invisibility. They have hard time organizing and collective bargaining. There is uncertainty about hours and availability of work, and child labor is an issue. So let's talk a little bit about the wage penalty in the next slide. If you look at the next slide, you will see that the wage penalty exists everywhere. Once you control for characteristics, such as occupation, education, and so on, everywhere there's a wage penalty. Do not be misled by the apparent wage bonus there is for Italy, because it's entirely explained by hours, and the wage penalty for Pakistan is 32%. So home workers make a third less than non-home workers, and we're comparing similar occupations, similar educational levels. The next slide will show us how are the earnings distributions of home workers. Let's look at the United Kingdom slide. On the vertical axis, we have the earnings, and on the horizontal axis, we have how many people make that amount of money. So if you look at it, you will see that in the gray line, which represents all workers who are, all workers who do not work from home, that the median or the most common earnings in the United Kingdom is somewhere around £700 per week. And if you look at the black line, the black curve, which represents home workers, you'll see that there is a peak at about 1,000 pounds per week, which are the teleworkers, highly skilled, highly educated, usually well paid, and then a lower peak, which is around 300 pounds, which corresponds to industrial home workers. Now let's look at Pakistan, which is in the middle. If we see Pakistan, we see the same two peaks. There's the highly skilled teleworkers. They exist. I put a little red T there so you can see them. But by far, the greatest amounts of home workers are industrial home workers, which are poorly paid. Okay, so let's try to investigate why they're poorly paid. In the next slide, we have the gender gaps for home workers and for non-home workers. What you can see is that except for the United States, gender gaps for home workers are much, much larger than for non-home workers. Why does this occur? I mean, both men and women are home workers. So why is it that women suffer a much larger wage penalty when they work from home than men do? Obviously, segmentation. Segmentation is the go-to explanation when you have very large wage gaps. So cultural norms segment the labor market. They do not allow the women to work. They can see the labor market from the window, but they cannot access it. Firms know this, take advantage of this, and this means that they pay the women very low piece rates or very low wages for whatever they're doing. So it's basically an issue which mixes a cultural issue, which segments the labor market, with an industrial organization issue, which is the firms taking advantage of the segmentation. So what can we do about this? So just to wrap up very quickly, the next slide shows us basically, well, ratify Convention 177, which Pakistan has not done, but Pakistan is not alone. Only about 10 countries have ratified it. And specifically focus on industrial homework. There's a lot that can be done to improve the lives and earnings of industrial home workers. It's not an impossible task. And I think that this is where most of the challenges lie ahead. So I have to stop now because my time is over, and I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sergey, for a very comprehensive presentation in 7 minutes. You discussed about the challenges, about the importance of having a comprehensive definition of homework to encompass different groups of home workers. I will now turn to Dr. Chen. So we have introduced Dr. Chen. She is the lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and co-founder of Vigo Network. So Dr. Chen is with us today to share her thoughts on size and composition of home-based workers across South Asia, globally, and in Pakistan. And she will also discuss the devastating impact of pandemic on home-based workers and what could be some solutions to address the key challenges that home-based workers are facing. So over to you, Dr. Chen.
Thank you so much, both Uzma and also Naji and the World Bank. It's such a pleasure to be part of this series and be talking about such an important category of workers, especially for women on International Women's Day. So as Uzma said, I'll present some variation on the global estimates that people have referenced, and then go into the findings from 2 COVID impact studies on home-based workers. Next. Noor, next, please. So more specifically, I'll just do a quick introduction of definition and typology so we're all on the same page. And then the official statistics, first ever global, which have been presented, but I'll quickly reference them. And then recent Pakistan statistics. And then the impact of COVID on home-based workers from 2 studies, one by HomeNet South Asia, which is the regional network of organizations of home-based workers, and then the WIGO network-led study, which was in 12 cities around the world, but 5 of them had home-based workers in the sample. But first, I wanted to just share with you, next, that there's a new HomeNet International, and I thought we should celebrate this on International Women's Day. And they had their founding congress in late February 23rd, 24th this year. And 36 affiliated organizations of home-based workers from 16 countries have joined HomeNet International, been the founding members. And 3 of these are in Pakistan. HomeNet Pakistan, which Laila represents, but also the Home-Based Women Workers Federation and Taba Pakistan. And at the launch Congress, the delegates from the 36 affiliates confirmed or adopted an international working committee, 3 representatives from each of the 4 regions, an international coordinator, Janvi Dave, adopted the constitution, membership fees, and a commitment to strengthening HomeNet International and building solidarity. So I think we should celebrate this newest federation of largely informal workers and home-based workers. Thank you. Next. So just, I think both Naji and also Sergey have referenced this, but I just want to be sure that we know that home-based workers are those who produce goods or provide services from in or around their own home, including in a structure attached to their home. And as Sergey alluded to, they can be found in all branches of the economy. There are some traditional sectors such as textile garments and shoe manufacturing in Pakistan, the soccer ball, the football. There are also modern sectors, including manufacturing of automobile parts and airplane cushions, electronic assembly, data collection and processing. And there are those who provide professional services from their own home, a lawyer or accountant who has a small office in her or his home. And certain types of home-based work predominate in specific country income groups. So your traditional self-employed, your home workers, your industrial home workers that Sergey referenced, and contributing family workers are more common in developing countries, whereas the self-employed professionals, the teleworkers and digital platform workers are more common in developed and emerging countries. So like the teleworker peak that we saw in the UK chart. Next. So we do have these first ever global statistics on home-based workers, thanks to the efforts of the ILO. And so we know that 260 million women and men are home-based workers around the world, and that the vast majority are in developing and emerging countries. And as somebody referenced, 2/3 of them are in Asia and the Pacific. And a majority of home-based workers are women, but not the vast majority that some of us might have expected. Next. And this is just a slide to compare Pakistan with South Asia and the world. And what it shows is the numbers in millions, and then the percentage of the total women and men's workforce that are home-based. And you'll see in Pakistan that the total percentage is lower than the average for South Asia. But this is largely because the total percent for men is so low. It's 2%, according to the data. And this was, I think, the 2000, Sajid Akhtar hopefully is here, but it's a fairly recent labor force survey, and he analyzed it. But the percentage of women workers who are home-based is particularly high in Pakistan at 28%. Next. I should say that in the data from Sajid, there's also a breakdown by what percentage of home-based workers are dependent versus independent self-employed. So I think the total dependent, including piece rate workers and casual workers and employees and contributing family workers, is something like 60%, but 65% for women. So let me turn now to the 2 studies on the impact of COVID on home-based workers. WeGo led a 12-city study across 5 regions, and 5 of the cities had home-based workers in the sample. 4 in Asia, Ahmedabad, Bangkok, Delhi, and Tirupur. But Pleven, Bulgaria was also one of the cities because there's a HomeNet Eastern Europe and we partnered with them on that. And the sample was 264 women, 35 men. And the HomeNet South Asia study was in 7 countries where HomeNet South Asia has affiliates, including Pakistan. And the total sample was 394 women home-based workers. And both studies used a similar questionnaire. HomeNet South Asia took the WIGO questionnaire and adapted it a bit for the focus on home-based workers, because our study had street vendors, voice pickers, domestic workers, as well as home-based workers. And both studies used key informant interviews by phone and in person. In the case of HomeNet South Asia, completely by phone in terms of the WIGO study. And we both partnered with local organizations of home-based workers in finding the local research team and understanding the ground reality. Next. So here is a summary slide or two of the impact of the COVID crisis. So April 2020 was the peak period of lockdowns and restrictions virtually everywhere. And what we found is that in terms of ability to work, the WIGO study found that more than 80% of home-based workers were not able to work during the peak lockdowns. In the case of the HomeNet South Asia, 69% of the home-based workers had no work, and 18 reported reduced work. So this, of course, was reflected in average earnings. And in April, in the 5 cities, the home-based workers were earning on average 10% of their pre-COVID earnings. And the HomeNet South Asia study found in 6 locations, they were earning less than 10% of pre-COVID earnings, and in 3 locations, 10 to 20%. The locations in the HomeNet South Asia case are Shahina Kirantunio, please mute. Thank you. And 3 locations, it was 10 to 20. The locations are more than the number of countries, because in a couple of countries, they had more than 1 location. After the lockdown restrictions had been eased by mid-2020, there was some signs of recovery, but certainly not robust recovery, quite slow. So in the WIGO study.
Marty, I'm very sorry to interrupt. You have 1 minute now. Okay.
Anyway, 65% of all workers and the vast majority of home-based workers were not able to work. And the average earnings were down. Next. And in terms of coping, in relief measures and coping, we saw that around 40% got some food aid or some cash grants, and a large percent had to go into negative coping mechanisms. Next. Next. So just ending 2 slides on recommendations. HomeNet South Asia had some recommendations about short-term relief to recovery, and then a social protection system during and after recovery that systematically and specifically covers home-based workers. Next. And the home-based workers in the WIGO study had common demands for recovery. In addition to the common demands for all informal workers, they wanted home-based workers to be recognized as essential workers. They rebuild the supply chains in fair and equitable ways, recognize home-based workers as workers with worker rights, that there needs to be market access and commercial rights for the self-employed, ratification of ILO convention, and basic infrastructure services for homes which double as workplaces. And the last slide, finally. So the forward to the HomeNet South Asia study report by the chair says recovery starts at the bottom, recovery starts with women, recovery starts today, recovery is a universal right. So I thought these points were very apt on International Women's Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chen, for a very comprehensive account of home-based workers' situation. And it resonates completely with the status of and issues of home-based workers in Pakistan also, especially on COVID. I'll now invite Umilela Azhar, Executive Director of HomeNet Pakistan. Naji has introduced her. Umilela is also directly working with provincial and federal government on policy and legislation related issues of home-based workers. So, Umilela, we would like you to briefly share your thoughts about different legislations on home-based workers in Pakistan. In fact, there was a question about it also in the chat, and what you think are some legislative gaps and how these legislations will support home-based workers in Pakistan. And what you think are key actions that should be prioritized for women home-based workers in the context of growing urbanization trends in Pakistan. Over to you, Umilela.
Thank you very much, Uzma and World Bank for having me here, and wishing all the participants here a very happy Women's Day. So with your question, I think I will start with the ILO 177. I think the whole parameter of like the home-based workers strategy and home-based workers advocacy for like having their recognition started with the ILO Convention 177. And over the years, almost about like 18 years, we have seen that there are now some legislations there. So I'll just highlight why the need for the home-based workers legislation, exclusive legislation for the home-based workers was there. So earlier, when like around in the late 90s and early 2000s millennium year, so there was a huge bulk force that we already know. All the data is there. We have all the participants earlier. Panelists have mentioned about the concentration of the home-based workers in the different supply chains and the different sectors. So the awareness came, or the issue arose when there was an evident evident example or the evident data of like women working in the informal economy, and they are concentrated in the garment and textile, leather industry, pottery, soccer ball. So that basically started the whole discussion in Pakistan, and eventually it became a point where the civil society organization like us, they started lobbying for having exclusive policies and laws and legislations for the home-based workers to bring them into the labor workforce. So earlier we also saw in 1998, the census was there, when census was going on, that the women were counted, but their work was not counted. So there has been a gap in the counting of the women also. And as Marty Chen has mentioned about the analysis of the labor workforce, we do count women, but their works are not counted. So they are not counted. They are not representative of the workforce, which is again a huge workforce, female labor workforce that we have. So that was basically the main argument. And also the condition of the home workers was not that that much that they were able to like come up to the expectations and look after their rights and everything. So that was basically the main idea when the whole lobbying started, and it started from a national policy and national legislation. I remember the whole context was taken from 177, and the Pakistan government, they agreed for having not ratifying the 177 because they were more concerned about the South Asian countries, whether they have ratified it or not. So they were like, there was a point of agreement that Pakistan government will bring in the national legislation or national policy for the home-based workers. But that was the time before pre-devolution. So the government started from the national policy. Eventually, when the devolution in 2011, after the devolution, the provinces adopted that national policy draft, and the national legislation that was already there was developed by the expert groups, labor expert group, and we were like part of that. So they adopted those. So Punjab came up with their policy, Punjab finalized the legislative draft, and then also Sindh simultaneously did that. So we have drafts of legislation already with us. Sindh adopted the policy. in 2017, and then the legislative draft in 2018. And simultaneously, Punjab has adopted the policy, and the draft is still under discussion, and it's going on the way. Likewise, other provinces also, following the example of other provinces, Punjab and Sindh, they started working on the home-based workers policy and legislation, and Balochistan draft of policy and legislation is already there. So now coming to your question, Kay, why there was a need? The need was there because women are working as a labor force, but they are not counted. And the huge workforce, as already pointed out, the number concentration is there. They are not represented in the labor force survey, and they are the non-agriculture, non-agri working women, and they are concentrated in the supply chains and not supply chains of the domestic work, manufacturing. They are also participating, and they are also working as hidden workers in the global supply chains also. So that basically was a point where all the governments were like taken on board. So now with the protection, coming to your second question, what will these legislation have an impact on these home-based workers? The first point is that when the legislation will be implemented, as Sindh is already going on, a huge workforce of women coming from the labor, informal labor, will be recognized as labor. So we'll have an increase in the female labor force participation. And eventually, if all other provinces adopt and start the implementation, we'll see the result that a huge women bulk is coming into the labor workforce. And there will be steps for like formalizing the informal economy for that. Secondly, they will have an access to the social protection, and they will have access to all the labor related schemes. It's old age benefit, minimum wage, things like that. So they will have a legal entity and legal recognition to have an access to all those laws and legislations and perks related with that. Thirdly is that this law will bring coordination and will build on the legislative based district and regional networks and set up a base for the verification and registration of the home-based workers. So there's going to be a long-term coordination. Thirdly, a budget, as the government has committed, they will be allocating budget for the implementation of the law, for bringing in facilitation and providing facilitation to the home-based workers, and also covering the occupational health and safety. So these are the important aspects that are related to the coverage that these home-based workers would eventually have if all the provinces adopt the law in a way that it is the governments are coming up. So I think I have answered all your questions, or is there anything else that is remaining?
Thank you so much, Umilela. That was very comprehensive. We will cover the rest of the questions also. You are right. Grassroots mobilization for home-based workers is very important for their empowerment, but it is also important for to make sure that there is accountability for the government also. And we are very glad that HomeNet Pakistan and the launch of HomeNet International will make this happen. So now our next panelist is Ms. Maria Beatriz Orlando. She has been introduced. She's our lead social development economist and specialist at the World Bank. So Maria Beatriz will share with us today some of the work World Bank has done and is currently doing on female labor force participation in Pakistan, and also on home-based workers issues. Over to you, Maria Beatriz.
Thank you, Uzma. Good morning and good evening to everyone. Happy International Women's Day. And in this presentation, we would like to make the connection between home-based work that our panelists have really described so well and gender issues in Pakistan specifically. Pakistan, in terms of the context regarding gender equality, paints a relatively bleak picture. Unfortunately, Pakistan is one of the countries in the world with the highest gender gaps. Gender equality gaps exist in health, education, and of course on women's economic empowerment and in the labor market. Pakistan ranks 151 out of 153 countries according to the Global Gender Gap Index. It's not very good news for International Women's Day. Lots of work to do, but hopefully it can be done, and home-based work can be one of many vehicles. Home-based work in Pakistan occurs in a context of extremely low levels of female labor force participation. This is very different from other countries that Professor Shen was referring to. It is one phenomenon if you have a lot of women in the labor market and then they concentrate in the home-based work, than in Pakistan where you have such few women in the labor market to begin with, and then on top of it, they're concentrated in home-based work. It's just important to keep that in mind. It's a very different context. The rate that you see on the slide is the yellow column is female labor force participation. The orange column is male labor force participation. Female labor force participation in Pakistan, as you can see, is around 22%, circa 2018, and is the lowest against every possible benchmark. Bangladesh has 36%, Indonesia 53%. The goal, as Naji said at the beginning when he opened our event, the goal of the government of Pakistan, according to the Pakistan Vision 2025, is to reach 45%, which is the middle income country benchmark. That's a very good benchmark, which is essentially half of the women participate in the labor force. That seems to be where most middle income countries are, and where mostly in terms of gender equality, where you have enough opportunity or at least basic opportunities in the labor market. If we go next, the next slide also shows, next please, it also shows that this picture is very telling because the rate is increasing, but not fast enough. What we should see on the left side of that orange line, instead of that kind of flat, little small hill at the end, we should be seeing a U-shaped curve according to the evolution that we have seen in many countries as they developed. In the beginning, there are many women in many precarious agricultural jobs, and then participation starts going down as incomes go up and as rural to urban migration goes up. And then eventually it starts going up again as jobs in the urban areas are also more accessible to women. This is not happening, and the urban rate is at 11.4%. By the way, as Professor Shen said, with COVID and given the latest data we have in Pakistan, we believe the latest rate for female labor force participation is mostly around 20%, not even 22%. So it has probably come down because of COVID and because of some adjustments in the data. So that is the context in which home-based workers go. Please, next. Home-based work is, as all the panelists have so aptly described, is an opportunity. And in the case of Pakistan, it's a very interesting opportunity because, it's a natural, in terms of traditional gender norms, it's a natural space for women to start working. And if you have such low levels of female labor force participation, it seems that it would be a good way to try to kind of, without rocking gender norms too much, without rocking the economy too much, to at least start opening these opportunities. And hopefully then also that will enhance women's participation in the economy overall, and you will see more mobility. So it's really a great opportunity. I won't repeat the statistics because Sergey and Professor Shen have already done so. I will only tell you that also in terms of women who are in the informal sector in Pakistan, and most of them are in home-based work. So most informal jobs for women in Pakistan are home-based. Next. Why is home-based work increasing in Pakistan? We see some very interesting mega trends, and why is it so overpopulated with women? So we have some global trends such as the rise of fast fashion, and this is an ILO report. Definitely the garment and textile industry are evolving and changing. Countries like Bangladesh have been able to really capitalize on this, and Pakistan also is growing in this sector. The rise of the digital economy, this should be opening great opportunities in terms of better paying jobs and jobs that are better quality. And the shift, of course, from agricultural to non-agricultural, even within the rural space. And of course, rural to urban migration, and Pakistan is rapidly urbanizing. This is why home-based work has been increasing, and particularly for women. So again, all these trends offer great opportunities in terms of high quality jobs. Next. Unfortunately, there are some gender challenges in addition of the economic challenges that everyone has mentioned that we need to pay close attention to to really transform home-based work in the real opportunity that promises to be. Otherwise, women will be working within confines, as our title for today's event tells us. So what are these gender challenges that kind of are so tied to issues of home-based work that our colleague Dr. Azar and Dr. Shen and Sergey have told us? So social norms, clearly, they determine, they rule what men and women do in life and in the labor market. And in the case of Pakistan, there are very rigid constraints in terms of women's mobility, spaces, social interaction, and occupational choices. And this has an impact on home-based work. What we would like to see in terms of economic development is that women and men choose occupations depending on their education level, their income potential of that occupation, and other circumstances, and they maximize that, and everybody can move into the jobs that are better for them, given their specific situation. It seems that in Pakistan, gender norms and social norms constrain that choice, and that is the problem. Beyond any other notions such as equity and justice, which are also very important, just purely from an economic point of view, if men and women are both into traditional occupations or working from home because it's the appropriate thing to do, not the right economic thing to do, it's bad from an economic perspective. Of course, domestic responsibilities play a huge role in terms of why women choose home-based work vis-a-vis the economic decision per se. But also, these domestic responsibilities don't go away when one works from home, as it has been painfully apparent for all of us working from home during COVID. Yes, it makes it easier to reconcile work and domestic responsibilities because one doesn't have the commute and you are present in case children need anything or whatever. But essentially, it also can constrain severely the productivity and the amount of hours that particularly women can work on. And if you don't put in the hours, and if you cannot be productive because you're constantly distracted or the heavy weight of domestic work, it's very hard to expand productivity in this context. Same goes for the limited mobility. If you stay at home and your mobility was limited to begin with, that can further reduce mobility. So something to really pay close attention to. And also when thinking about policies and programming. Last but not least, lack of access to capital. Only 11% of women have bank accounts compared to 21% of men. So already very low.
You have 1 minute. Sorry to interrupt.
Wrapping up. Okay, excellent. So just this, just to illustrate that gender challenges can really affect how home-based work can be an opportunity. If we go to the next, we can talk a little bit. Next slide, please. Do we also mention lack of access to networks and lack of access to technology? Going to we're going to skip this slide because the other panelists have really enlightened us. I wanted to share in a few seconds, Uzma going to next, what the World Bank is doing. And this is work that our colleagues are putting forward. And Uzma actually has been playing a very important role, is a development policy loan that Naji mentioned at the beginning called Securing Human Investments to Foster Transformation, SHIFT Development Policy Financing Series. This loan and this series of loans has one pillar on recognizing the contribution of women for economic productivity, and very specifically supporting the government of Pakistan in terms of legislative reforms and policy reforms to increase women's economic participation, and also recognize home-based work and improve the conditions of home-based work. And this is something that has been discussed. So as the World Bank, we're very proud of supporting the government of Pakistan and all our counterparts in this big effort. Just to conclude, last slide, please. Next, please. Thank you. Some recommendations that come from our work on gender in the labor markets in Pakistan and particularly home-based work. I'll just focus on two because the others have been mentioned. Definitely in terms of when it comes to women in home-based work, that last column, that last pillar that you see, support, is very important. And the support, there's a lot of emphasis on social protection, but it seems that in some segments, actually, a childcare support and also linking women to some network, to some group, to some community is absolutely crucial. And it may even come before the other recommendations. Childcare can be provided via community, via a network of home-based workers themselves. And we also need to be creative and really apply everything we have learned about women entrepreneurs in other fields to the case of home-based workers. And I'm talking here specifically about self-help groups and how they could perhaps also help home-based workers who are women. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maria Beatriz, for highlighting the policy work and the significance to focus on improving income, skills, networks for home-based workers, and their social protection also, once the laws are passed in all provinces. So just to add here, the policy work that Maria Beatriz highlighted, and we have been talking about it also, it's being supported by UN Women, ILO, and several civil society organizations for the past many years. And World Bank, through its development policy credit, we are supporting the government and development partners' efforts to enact these policies and laws for the protection of home-based workers in all provinces and also at the federal level. So our last but not the least and a very dynamic presenter today is Hasina, who is a home-based worker, and she has been associated with HomeNet Pakistan. She's a business owner also. She's also the founder of a small center. And during the COVID break, what happened to her centers, we are going to discuss today Hasina's story, her journey as home-based worker, and how pandemic affected her, and what she thinks the government and other partners should do to support their empowerment. So अब हम हसीना के साथ बात करेंगे, जो कि होम बेस्ड वर्कर हैं और बिजनेस ओनर भी हैं, और हम उनसे उनके एक्सपीरियंस के बारे में जानना चाहते हैं. हसीना, अगर आप हमें थोड़ा सा अपने बारे में बता दें कि जब आपने होम बेस्ड वर्कर के तौर पे स्टार्ट किया था तो कैसे किया, उस वक्त आपको क्या मसाइल दरपेश आए, अगर उसके ऊपर थोड़ी सी बात कर रहे हैं. हसीना
जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम. मुझे वो मसाइल का सामना तो काफ़ी करना पड़ा. सब पहले तो मैंने ये हैंड वर्क का काम जब मैं करती थी तो इसमें बहुत से इशू आ गए और इसमें काफ़ी मसाइल का सामना करना पड़ता है. और मसाइल क्योंकि ये ख़वातीन जब हम सारी रात बैठ के काम करते हैं, सारा दिन बैठ के काम करते हैं, घर का काम भी अलग होता है, अपने हस्बैंड को भी टाइम देना पड़ता है, अपने बच्चों को भी टाइम देना पड़ता है और इस काम को भी टाइम देना पड़ता है. यानी एक जो जॉब करने वाला बंदा होता है उसके टाइम का लिमिट का पता होता है, 8 घंटे काम कर रहे हैं, 10 घंटे, मगर हमारे टाइम का कोई लिमिट, कोई कुछ भी नहीं है, क्योंकि हम जिस टाइम भी जैसे ही थोड़ा सा फ्री होते हैं जल्दी अपने काम की तरफ आ जाते हैं. तो यानी हम दिन को भी बैठे रहते हैं और रात को भी बैठे रहते हैं. इस तरह मेरे काम की शुरुआत हुई जब होम बेस जब इस तरह हमारे काम की शुरुआत हुई और होम बेस वर्कर तक फिर मैं होम बेस वर्कर बन गई. और इस तरह होते होते फिर होम नेट से अटैच हुई. होम नेट से मुख्तलिफ किस्म की ट्रेनिंग्स वगैरह हमने ली, बहुत सी बिजनेस के हवाले से ऑनलाइन ट्रेनिंग थी और मुख्तलिफ किस्म की ट्रेनिंग जब हमने ली तो उससे मुझे काफ़ी मालूमात हासिल हुई. और फिर इस तरह होते होते इस ट्रेनिंग के बाद मेरे उस जहन में एक सवाल आया कि अगर हम बेस वर्कर के ऊपर इतनी ज़्यादा तकलीफें हो रही है, इतना कुछ हो रहा है और इतने मसाइल का सामना करना पड़ रहा है, तो मैं इस तरह क्यों ना करूं कि ये साथ में ये काम भी करे कि एक सेंटर की शुरुआत भी करते हैं ताकि वो काम भी चलता रहे और ये काम भी चलता रहे. इस तरह सेंटर की जब शुरुआत हुई तो मैंने यहाँ नाथा खान गोट, ये एक ऐसा एरिया है जो पसमानदा इलाका है. मैंने इस इलाके में सेंटर की शुरुआत की. सेंटर की जब शुरुआत की फिर इस तरह मेरा काम होम बेस वर्कर से आके मैं आहिस्ता वुमेन्स बिजनेस वुमेन बन गई. और फिर मैंने होम बेस वर्कर को अब हम तैयार कर रहे हैं, बहुत सी ख़वातीन को तैयार कर रहे हैं और बहुत सी ख़वातीन तैयार हो चुकी है, बहुत से होम बेस वर्कर बन चुके हैं. और अभी मैं ये चाहती हूँ कि वो ख़वातीन भी अपने पैरों पर खड़े होकर बिजनेस वुमेन बन जाएं.
थैंक यू सो मच हसीना. मैं आपकी बात को थोड़ा सा ट्रांसलेट भी कर दूं बाकी पैनलिस्ट के लिए. So Hasina shared with us her story that, she started off as home-based worker. She experienced lots of problems, and also in terms of work limit, there was no time limit. She also had to engage in household work, And she got, though she, you know, on the way, once she started working, she started getting lots of orders. And during that process, she was also engaged with HomeNet Pakistan, that trained her, gave her lots of trainings on leadership also. And once she, you know, started getting orders from different organizations, she also started thinking of engaging with other women who were home-based workers, to connect with them and to start working together. So the problems were there, but she wanted to empower and she wanted to support other women home-based workers also on the way. हसीना, मुझे आपसे पूछना ये था कि जैसे आपने जब सेंटर खोल लिया अपना, आपने बताया कि आपने अपना सेंटर खोल लिया, तो उसमें जब ये जब दूसरी खवातीन भी आपके साथ आ गई, तो उसमें जब कोरोना की वजह से क्या कोई मसाइल हुए आपके बिजनेस के ऊपर? और अगर आप थोड़ा सा बता दें कि पहले जब कोरोना से पहले आपकी जो है वो होम बेस्ड वर्कर्स के साथ, तो आपने बता दिया कि अच्छा चलना शुरू हो गया, तो उसके बाद फिर कैसे हुआ?
जब मैंने सेंटर खोला तो उसमें, जैसे ही मैंने सेंटर खोला, इसमें होमनेट ने मेरी मदद की मशीनें देकर। जैसे ही मैंने सेंटर को खोला, इसमें थोड़े अरसे के बाद कोरोना बीमारी आई और बहुत से लोग इसमें जो एडमिशन उन्होंने ले लिया। तो इसमें जब ये बीमारी आई, कोरोना है, तो उसमें मुझे काफ़ी मसाइल का सामना करना पड़ा, क्योंकि जो टीचर मैंने रखे हुए थे सैलरी बेसिस पे, उनकी सैलरी जो थी वो मेरे ऊपर आई और उस जगह की रेंट भी मुझे देना पड़ा। और जो कितने महीने हम लोगों ने जब ये सेंटर बंद किया, तो वो उसका सारा रेंट मेरे ऊपर आ गया। और उन लोगों को भी जिन्होंने जितनी मैंने मेहनत की थी, उनको यहाँ तक पहुँचना में, ताकि वो अपनी बच्चियों को आराम से अपने यहाँ पर एडमिशन के लिए इजाज़त दे दे, क्योंकि मैं इस एरिया में रहती हूँ जहाँ पर लड़कियों को बाहर जाने की इजाज़त नहीं है। मगर बहुत मेहनत से, बहुत कोशिश से वो लड़कियां यहाँ पर एडमिशन लिया, मगर कोरोना की वजह से मेरा सारा सेंटर जो था वो बंद करना पड़ा, मुझे काफी नुकसान उठाना पड़ा और कई महीनों तक मैंने इस सेंटर को बंद किया। फिर मैंने वापस हिम्मत मैंने नहीं आ रही, मैंने वापस कोशिश की। फिर मैंने अपने घर से ही फिर शुरुआत की कि नहीं, मेरा घर भी इन्हीं के बीच में है, रेंट की जगह है। मैंने वापस अपने घर में 2 कमरों को खाली कर दिया। 2 कमरों को खाली करके यहाँ पर मैंने वापस अपनी मशीनें, अपनी चीजें वापस शुरू कर दी। मेरा एक काम है हैंड वर्क का बिजनेस, दूसरा है ये सेंटर में यहाँ पर सिलाई कोर्स बच्चों को सिखाया जा रहा है, मेहंदी की क्लासें हो रही हैं और ब्यूटिशियन की क्लासें हो रही है, ब्यूटी क्लासें। तो उनके लिए मैंने टीचर रखे हुए हैं। तो और सिलाई की क्लास भी मैं खुद देती हूँ, क्योंकि मेरा एक्सपीरियंस सिलाई में भी है काफी है, और हैंड वर्क जो बलोचिस्तान का कदीम काम है, उसमें भी मेरा काफी एक्सपीरियंस है। तो वापस फिर मैंने अपने घर से इसकी शुरुआत की। अब मैं शुरू तो किया है, अल्लाह का शुक्र है, इसकी शुरुआत तो की है, लोग भी आहिस्ता आहिस्ता वापस आने शुरू हो गए हैं। बस कुछ मसाइल ये मेरे साथ पेश आए हैं कि बहुत सी ज़रूरियात है जिसको मैं अफोर्ड नहीं कर सकती हूँ, बहुत सी चीज़ें हैं, क्योंकि सिर्फ ये अकेली मेरी जिम्मेदारी में इस जगह की जो बिल वगैरह है वो भी दे रही हूँ, साथ में जो और भी ज़रूरत की अशिया है वो भी छोटी मोटी ले रहे हैं, मगर सारी ज़रूरत की अशिया मैं नहीं पूरी कर सकती हूँ। बस हिम्मत नहीं हार रही हूँ, इस काम को मैं लेकर आगे चल रही हूँ ताकि यहाँ के लोगों के लिए आसानी हो। और इस यहाँ के लोगों में मुस्लिम बरादरी भी है और हिंदू बरादरी भी है और ईसा बरादरी भी है। साथ में मेरे एक क्रिश्चियन कॉलोनी भी चर्च होती है और दूसरी तरफ से सिंधी पाड़ा जहाँ पे हिंदू बरादरी रहती है। तो यहाँ के लोग सब यहाँ पर आहिस्ता आहिस्ता उन्होंने रुजू किया, मुस्लिम लोगों ने भी आहिस्ता आहिस्ता यहाँ पर सब आ रहे हैं। हालांकि छोटा सा घर है, मगर मैंने टाइम रखा हुआ है कि इस टाइम इतनी लड़कियां आ सकती है, इस टाइम इतनी लड़कियां आ सकती हैं। तो इस तरह हम इसको एक मुश्किल तरीके से कर रहे हैं। बस ये है कि अल्लाह इस खैरियत से इसको और आगे बढ़ाए ताकि हम यहाँ के लोगों के लिए आसानी काम और कर सकें। जी,
थैंक यू सो मच हसीना. Hasina has been telling us that the HomeNet Pakistan, they helped her set up the center, and she's started the center in an area where women had very limited mobility, and Hasina had to work very hard to get permissions for those women to access the center and start learning all those courses that Hasina was providing. And it was about, there were courses about beautician, there were courses about stitching. But due to COVID, the center had to close. And there were several problems also that Hasina had to face because she was certainly faced with massive financial problems. She had to pay rent, she had to pay the pending salaries also, and all this, complicated the issue. She had to return all the fees also that she obtained from students. So the orders that she was getting, they also got reduced, and household expenses they expanded, and Hasina didn't have money to make both ends meet. So as the COVID situation improved a little, so she decided to start again, but she didn't have money to pay for the rent, so she started working from home, and now she's operating from her own home. थैंक यू सो मच हसीना. कोई ऐसी चीज है जो कि आप गवर्नमेंट को कहना चाहती हैं, या आप दूसरे इदारे जो इसके ऊपर काम कर रहे हैं, जैसे वर्ल्ड बैंक है या जो भी इदारे हैं, होमलैंड पाकिस्तान भी, ये सब जो इस पे काम कर रहे हैं, उनको आप क्या मैसेज देना चाहती हैं कि होम बेस्ड वर्कर्स के लिए क्या होना चाहिए?
होम बेस्ड वर्कर्स के लिए ये खवातीन जो सारी सारी रात और दिन काम करती हैं, इनको अक्सर बीमारियां लाहक हो जाती है, कमर का दर्द, अक्सर आंखें वीक हो जाती हैं. तो इनके लिए एक तो कार्ड इशू किए जाए, ऐसे हेल्थ कार्ड जिससे ये अपना इलाज आसानी से कर सके, और वो 1 साल 2 साल का कार्ड नहीं हो, वो पूरी लाइफ का हो. और दूसरी बात ये, एक जब ये हैंडवर्क का काम किया जाता है, हम जैसे ही पेज को अपने पेज बनाते हैं, ऑनलाइन काम करते हैं, हमारी तरफ लोग इतनी मुतवज्जा नहीं होते, इतने हमारी तरफ मुतवज्जा नहीं होते. वो ब्रांड को देखते हैं, वो कहते हैं कि नहीं, अगर हम एक कुर्ती 2000 की सेल कर रहे हैं तो वो हमारी तरफ रुजू नहीं करेंगे. वो चाहे नाम ही को देखते हैं, वो लोग नाम ही को देखते हैं. तो अगर वो एक कुर्ती 500 रुपए 5000 की भी सेल कर रहे हो, तो वो 5000 की कुर्ती ले लेते हैं, हालांकि वही काम हम ही लोगों ने किया हुआ है. मगर मैं कहती हूँ इसके ऊपर भी कोई काम होना चाहिए, कोई ऐसा कुछ ऐसा होना चाहिए कि हम डायरेक्ट ऐसे इदारों के साथ कनेक्ट हो जाए जो आराम से वो बाहर सेल कर सके, ऐसे इदारे बनाए जाए. तो मेरी ये एक ख्वाहिश भी है, और ये हमारी जरूरत भी है.
Thanks so much, Hasina. So Hasina thinks that health card, women home based workers access to health benefits is extremely critical, because they don't have any access to medical benefits or any other such resources. So that's one critical point where they definitely need support. And then she also thinks that compensation for the work that home based workers do is also something that policymakers and other organizations need to keep on their radar, because they don't get compensated for the amount of work that they do, and for the level of effort that they put in and the skills that they utilize. And similarly, access to markets is also a very big issue. So she would want all home-based workers to have access to those organizations, to those markets where their goods or products will be purchased on an adequate, decent price. Thank you so much, Hasina. आपका बहुत शुक्रिया. हम अभी हम डिस्कशन में भी उसके ऊपर सवाल लेंगे और आपकी तरफ दोबारा आएंगे. So now we are done with presentations, and so participants have also asked some questions, and they are in the chat box, and I'll be sending them to the panelists. So we have received some questions from participants about social protection. Sergey, maybe you would want to take this question about the social protection, that what sort of social protection should be specifically provided to home-based workers, and home-based workers. I mean, how do we differentiate between home-based workers and other informal sector workers from a social protection point of view? And maybe you could also share some examples, if there are any global or regional examples in this regard. Over to you, Sergey.
Okay, thank you very much. It's not an easy question. Social protection for home workers, and I can't give a one-size-fits-all answer. One-size-fits-all answers are usually wrong. So since most home-based workers are specifically informal, we have to look at good experience for social protection for informal workers, okay? So, things like monotax come to mind, which in some countries have been very, very very successful. I have no idea whether Pakistan has anything like this, which is you pay a small fee, you inscribe yourself in social protection, and you're protected, and you get a protection package, sometimes which is the equivalent of a full formal social protection. Sometimes it's a watered down version. But for home workers specifically, there is an example, which would be the BD laws in India, in which, given the difficulty of taxing the worker themselves to provide the protection, they tax the product, creating thus a BD fund, which is which can be, used for social protection of workers. The literature is not very positive about how it worked, but it has never, in my knowledge, been well evaluated. So we don't really know how well it worked. So I know that this is a very incomplete answer, but there is not as of now, there's not a very good answer as to how to provide social protection for informal home workers. Of course, if they're formal, the problem doesn't really apply.
Thank you so much, Sergey. So we will be looking towards chat also. If there are other follow-up questions, we will be sending them your way. So there was another question about the implementation of home-based workers policies and laws also, and there was a question about what sort of legislations are there. I think that question got partially addressed during the presentations. So the question to you and Marty and other panelists is that, how will this implementation look like once the laws are passed? For example, in Pakistan, we have one law in Sindh, and we are looking towards, adoption of multiple legislations in different provinces. So how will it look into practice? So the implementation, what benefits will it bring? Marty, should we direct this question to you?
Sure. I can take a stab. Just to add to an example of social protection for informal workers in general, but also a country that has a law based on the Convention 177, which is Thailand. And I think we really should look at Thailand carefully, because HomeNet Thailand was among the civil society groups that pushed for a more universal social protection, which added a pillar for those who were not covered by formal worker coverage or the military or the bureaucracy that had the other pillars of social protection. And one of the provisions of that is that there are committees, sort of working groups at national and provincial and local levels that are they're tripartite, to use the ILO concept, but they also include these organizations of home-based workers and their allies. And so that helps with the implementation if you have people who really know the ground reality and are involved in the working groups for implementation at the various levels. So I think there's a lot to be learned from Thailand. And just a footnote on the welfare funds in India that Sergey referenced, those from the bottom-up perspective have been very important. I don't know the studies and how on a net they worked, but those welfare funds have been for construction workers, BD rollers. There's been a push to get them for incense stick rollers, where, like Sergey said, the industries are taxed for the volume of their turnover in the product line, and then these welfare funds are created. However, these are now under threat under the current government in India. So it's a very good model that's under threat, and we need to watch that very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marty.
Can I add something, Uzma?
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Just now, very quickly. Clearly, the legislation in practice, when we see in Pakistan, we should be able to monitor working conditions for home-based workers and seeing some improvement. I think what would be really amazing is if we somehow could link the efforts on legislation and policy with some community level or networks of different networks of home-based workers, and kind of establish a way of kind of monitoring jointly, kind of having some participatory monitoring added into it to see, when doing implementation, what things can be adjusted and what can be improved over. Thank you.
Uzma, can I just add to this, if you may allow?
Please go ahead.
Yes, I think this is very important and very critical also, because when it comes to the social protection, the issue of like the contribution from the employer is always there. So what Marty just mentioned, the bill of the case study of Thailand, that is very important, and basically based on that, the recommendation has been given to the government of Sindh for like proposing amendments in the existing Sindh social protection law. Not only this, I think there is also important. This is also important to see that the social protection law, they should have some separate schemes for covering the women in the informal economy, and specifically the home-based workers. So the Sindh is coming up with this universal social security. So that unit is already working, and they have included the home-based workers also. So I think that paradigm of like having a universal social security for the home-based workers who do not have a recognized employer and they are working for several employers, so there has to be a mechanism. And I think a Thailand example, and then again the Philippine example of like self-registration for the social security is very important, that is under discussion with the Sindh government, and vis-a-vis all the governments should take into account that. There is another example that I would like to mention here is the India process of like providing social protection to the informal workers, and it is through the UWIN card. And the UWIN card is a registration number, a special identification number that they allocate to the workers who register, get themselves self-registered with the government, and they are allocated a number. And those workers are included. Those workers are from agriculture field. They are home-based workers. They are street vendors, and they are domestic workers. So that is another example. And all these recommendations have been given to the government of Pakistan at the federal level and all the provincial governments. So they and I agree that all the working committees of the labor needs to have these recommendations there when they are planning the step ahead for bringing the home-based workers in the social security.
Can I raise a point just quickly? The social registries are very important. During COVID, one of the study sites, the WIGO study, was Tirupur in Tamil Nadu, which is the t-shirt capital of the world. And the local union of home-based workers had been trying before COVID to register home-based workers as workers under the state labor ministry. It hadn't happened, but because they were not registered, the home-based workers did not get the state level, all of the state level relief benefits that they needed to be. So social registries are hugely important. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much, Marty, Sergey, Maria Beatriz, Umilela, Hasina. थोड़ा सा मैं उर्दू में भी बता दूं कि हमने कुछ एग्जांपल्स शेयर किए हैं अभी सोशल प्रोटेक्शन के हवाले से भी, उसके ऊपर कुछ क्वेश्चंस आए थे। हसीना ने भी बात की थी कि हेल्थ बेनिफिट्स होने चाहिए, तो हमारे पास उसके एग्जांपल्स हैं, रीजन में भी हैं, इंडिया से, थाईलैंड से जहाँ पे लॉ पास हो गया है, और फिलीपींस में, और मार्टी ने भी बात की है सोशल रजिस्ट्री की कि जब तक होम बेस्ड वर्कर्स की रजिस्ट्रेशन नहीं होगी तो ये बहुत मुश्किल होगा कि उनके बेनिफिट्स जो हैं उनको मिल सकें। एंड मार्टी बाय द वे कैन आल्सो स्पीक उर्दू, so we will be asking her to respond.
मैं भी समझ सकती हूँ आपका।
Perfect. So we have some other questions also in the chat box, and then in some other windows also. Sergey, I think you can respond to this question about professional services like accounting and legal may not necessarily be informal. So would we still qualify for social services and leniency in taxation or legal compliance costs? Would you be able to respond to this, or maybe we can ask them to clarify this further also if it's not clear?
Maybe clarify it a little more, because in general, when you have special regimes for people who are informal or not fully formal, they sometimes they often specify which types of occupations or industries these regimes are for, but this isn't like a necessity. That you could have a general regime which would be for all home workers, for example. I don't know.
There's another very broad question also, which I think I can send to MB. MB, would you be interested in responding to this? Is working from home a solution to gender inequality?
Okay, if I can start, and I would love to hear from everyone, each panelist. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity. I think, frankly, we can really say that. I mean, it's much better for women to have access to some income than not to have any income, given the low levels of female labor force participation, access to finance, etc., in Pakistan. So it is an opportunity, but it's not a solution. That's how I would qualify the response. And for this opportunity to really offer a lot of empowerment and access to economic resources to women, there are a lot of things that are needed. And definitely my message will be we have to pay attention to the gender inequalities that are already in the country in order to really transform home-based work into an opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, so if no one else wants to take this forward, I have another question, which is about data collection on home-based workers. Marty's presentation, Maria Beatrice's presentation, and Sergey also talked about different statistics existing at the regional, also at the Pakistan level on home-based worker statistics. So my question is, how can these data collection related challenges and problems be addressed, considering the current limitations? For example, in home-based workers data in Pakistan, it gets underreported. It is misreported in some instances because their data is counted as unpaid work in some surveys. So how can we address these different challenges? Marty, would you like to start?
Yes, I would, because the WIGO network has been working since 1997 with the ILO and national statistical offices to improve data on informal workers in general and home-based workers in particular. And I want to make a plea for improving labor force surveys. There's a couple points there. There can be some ad hoc surveys. There can also be, like the World Bank has, some living standard measurement surveys, which are more regular. But we've done an audit and we've compared results in different countries, and the labor force surveys are hugely important, and we need to invest in those. And what is needed to capture this, in addition to the enumeration respondent issues, technical issues, one is a place of work question in all labor force surveys. Pakistan has it, but some countries do not. South Africa still does not. It's a simple module. We can send around what that should be, but you have to have a place of work question in the labor force survey. Then for home-based workers, you need to be able to distinguish between the self-employed, the employees, and the subcontracted, right? And that's a bit more complicated, but what we have found, HomeNet Thailand is very committed to improving the national statistics. And so they have set up opportunities for technical advice and engagement, which WIGO has done for the last 5 years, referring to the ILO persons involved in both Bangkok and Geneva to really improve the data. So there's a role for the home nets and the organizations of workers to engage with the national statistical offices, because you are the informed users of the data, and there needs to be a user-producer collaboration. And then if you can involve, like WIGO has in Pakistan, a technical data analyst like Sajid Akhtar in those negotiations, that is really important for improving data collection.
I'd like to say that I agree with everything that Martha said, but I would also like to point out the importance of labor market registries. The labor force surveys are crucial, and there's much work to be done in them. But when you're labor force statistics also involve labor market registries, and labor market registries are the statistics that actually change reality because you register individual home workers. And I think that's really important to amplify the registration in labor market registries as well.
Usma, can I just add on to this? Can I just add on this? I think all the points made by Marty and researchers are important, and we understand that the labor force surveys, they do count the women in the informal economy, but since as our engagement with the National Statistics Bureau and the provincial bureaus, we found out that many years back, it's now 14 or 15 years back, we found out that they do have the household data, but the analysis is not there. As Marty was saying, that Sajid Akhtar Saab has done the analysis. It was done for the first time in 2011. ILO did that, and then we found out that the household survey does have this, but the analysis is not done. So yes, I agree that we need to have a close engagement with the statistical offices. And secondly, what we have seen over the years is that Nepal has included a question of home workers in their national census, and this was a major what would I say? This is a major development where they have a national data on home workers. I think that is a good practice also, and like having the national census and then the national data for home-based workers exclusively would pay off. So we need to see the Nepal example also.
Thanks so much, Umilela. Naji, would you like to come in here?
Yes, I wanted to ask a question to the panel. So I wanted to know what's the experience and the literature on pickup in terms of registering home-based workers. So we know the literature on informal firms, that very few formalize, and basically all experiments in terms of formalizing informal firms either don't work, or the firm behavior doesn't change, but firms don't want to formalize in fine, most of them. What's the experience with home-based workers, women particularly, in terms of pickup and in terms of the benefits when they register, if they register? Over.
Marty, would you like to take it? Taking examples from other regions?
Yeah, I teach a course at Harvard on the informal economy. Is formalization the answer? ? So, and two things. One is that a large percentage, the majority of home-based workers in Pakistan, for instance, and many countries, are not independent, self-employed, right? They're dependent. They're employees, they're subcontracted workers, they're casual laborers, and a large percentage, you'll see from the Pakistan data, are what are called contributing family workers. They depend on a member of the family who's registered in the statistics as an own account operator. So first of all, so most of the formalization discourse is about enterprises formalizing, right? But most of them, the majority, are not themselves enterprises that they're dependent. So what needs to be formalized or looked at in the case of the dependent ones is more the employment relationship or the terms on which they're engaged in supply chain. That would be really important to them, right? And the other point about formalization, which I think there's growing understanding of, is that it has to come with benefits, not just costs, right? So that, registration and paying taxes as sort of the narrow idea of formalization is being questioned by all of these groups. And by two reasons. One is that they want some benefits if they register. And the second is 2 points about taxes. One is they feel they pay different kinds of taxes, user fees and other things to the government, and don't get anything, whether those are taxes or not, but sort of And the other is that most of them do not earn the threshold for either corporate or personal income tax, right? So that, it's sort of a misnomer that the way to solve the revenue issue is to tax the informal. So there's a lot of issues around the formalization debate. But what kind of formalization they want is they want this legal recognition as workers that we've heard about, right? And they want the rights that come with being legally understood to be economic agents. They want the right to social protection. They want the right to be built into local economic development and economic development more generally. And because the home is the workplace, for the home to be more productive, they need some kind of de facto tenure and some kind of basic infrastructure services at the home. So that's what formalization means to them, right? And that's what they're struggling for. Thank you.
Maybe I can just tell a story from my country, which is Brazil. We a while ago we established a monotax for informal workers, okay, for self-employed informal workers. It is one of the best deals that you can imagine. I mean, you pay a very small amount per month, and you get back maternity leave, you get back sickness pay, you get back unemployment insurance, you get back a very, very good package. So, I'm a labor economist. We sat down, we did the math, and we found out that it was basically the best investment anybody could possibly make in Brazil. And yet the take-up wasn't zero, but it wasn't 100%. I mean, a lot of people who could have taken it up did not. And I think that's to say that, in addition to just the calculation of costs and benefits, there is also a culture of informality which must be addressed. But if in addition to this, there are few avenues for formalization of the workers, and I'm talking just about the workers, not the firms. There are few formalizations for workers to register. There are few avenues for workers to register themselves. It makes it a lot harder.
If I may add, I think, Naji, when we talk about uptake in Pakistan, concern is that you're talking mostly about women, and in our experience, in terms of programs that have succeeded with female domestic workers or fruit pickers or any sector in which you have a lot of women sort of segregated in the sector, the concern is that there needs to be an extra push. In the case of Pakistan specifically, there will be concerns regarding whether women have documents, just personal ID, for instance, just a basic, or any other form of basic access to finance. So the success stories that I'm aware of, like there's one success story in Chile with fruit pickers and others, are situations in which the registration is paired to another program, whether it's a financial inclusion program or, as Sergey and Dr. Shen were referring to, any other social protection program or a training program. So the best success I have seen in terms of actually reaching out to women is registration that is paired to another program. Over. Thank you.
Uzma, can I just add on to this?
Sure.
Yes, I just want to mention two examples. One is that the Punjab Social Protection Authority that is there. I think that is something that can be very, very useful for covering the home-based workers through registration first from the Labour Department, and then directing them to the Punjab Social Protection Authority. That is one thing. In the second example, I just wanted to quote, as Serge has mentioned, that we also did with the support of UN Women. We collaborated with the private sector for the home-based workers and tried to bring them into the health insurance, and that was for I think 2 years. So we were able to cover around 300 women at that time, if I correctly remember the number. So those health packages were basically designed on the needs of the home-based workers, and it also covered their outdoor facilities, and it also covered their maternity. So they were like bringing in the private sector for providing social protection to the women was something that was showcased with the governments also. And I think that this is something that we have some scope there. But nonetheless, the government is responsible for bringing the covering the social security. So as I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a revision or amendment in the social security, and there has to be a special scheme, specialized scheme for covering the home-based workers through that social security. So that can be one from by the Punjab Social Protection Authority. That is a very good model that we can see.
Thanks so much, Avelala. I think we are running out of time. Thank you to all the panelists for their excellent recommendations and inputs. It was very, very insightful. Thank you so much. Happy International Women's Day, and thank you to all our participants also who took time out amidst, the magnificent marches that are happening today in Pakistan in different cities, including in Islamabad. So very, very grateful for all of you to be with us and asking us questions. I will now request Naji to share the closing remarks. Khawateen ka Almi Din Mubarak. Thank you very much. Over to Naji.
Thank you very much, Uzma. I'd like to thank you as well, Huma, and the whole team. And thank particularly the panelists. This was excellent exchange, excellent experiences. Learned a lot. Maybe if we could share on the website or on the Facebook page, if we could share some of the presentation, it would be great. I mean, there was very, very interesting numbers and informations and studies. So really appreciate your time, and thanks for the participants and the questions received. This will be the recording will be available, and we'll also provide a summary of the session as we do for each of our webinar series. And thank you everyone, and have a good International Women's Day. And really glad we could have this today on this particularly important topic. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz. Nice meeting you all.
Bye.
Khuda Hafiz. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Hafiz.